Miss Marple and the Murder at Maplebrook Tea Room, a Miss Marple story section 1, The Garden Club's delightful gathering. It was a golden afternoon in early September, and the sleepy village of Maplebrook basked under a sky brushed with soft clouds. The hedgerows along the narrow lanes swelled with ripe blackberries, and bees hummed lazily between the last of the season's roses. Life, it seemed, moved at an unhurried pace in this corner of the English countryside. Dot at the heart of the village stood the Maplebrook Tea Room, a whitewashed building with ivy creeping up its walls and lace-curtained windows that glimmered in the sunlight. Once a modest grocer's, it had been converted a few years prior into a fashionable gathering place for the ladies of the Maplebrook Garden Club, an institution that had taken on increasing social importance since the arrival of its proprietor, the vivacious Miss Letitia Blackwood. Miss Blackwood was a woman of about 40, with auburn hair always styled into a smooth chignon, and a laugh that rang out with practiced charm. She had moved to Maplebrook from London after what she vaguely referred to as a change of pace, and quickly established herself as a pillar of the village's social life. Her tea room served the finest Darjeeling, the fluffiest scones, and her Thursday afternoon garden club meetings were the highlight of many a village calendar. On this particular Thursday, a table had been set on the back patio beneath a wide blue and white striped umbrella. Teacups clinked, birds chirped in the lilac hedges, and a faint breeze stirred the linen napkins. The ladies of the garden club were seated in a circle of wicker chairs, sipping tea and discussing begonias with a seriousness usually reserved for national policy. Miss Marple, that sweetly unassuming old lady from St. Mary Mead who was visiting her niece, sat unobtrusively near the end of the table, though her lace gloves and pale blue dress blended her into the decor quite nicely. Her mind was anything but idle. She watched, listened, and observed with the care of one who had long since learned that the smallest detail often said the most. "Now you see," said Mrs. Lavinia Crane, the vicar's wife, as she stirred her tea, "I think the trick with peonies is to keep them out of direct sunlight. They faint like Victorian ladies, poor things." "Really, Lavinia," drawled Mrs. Dorothy Munsell, the retired schoolmistress, "it's far more likely your peonies are sulking from being overwatered." "Oh, nonsense, it's the soil," interjected Miss Blackwood cheerfully. "You want just a touch of acidity. Coffee grounds work wonders." There was laughter and a comfortable murmur of dissent. The conversation drifted next to pruning roses, followed by speculation on whether or not Gerald Fothergill, the reclusive widower at Rosemere Cottage, might finally sell his property. Miss Marple smiled softly, noting with faint amusement how quickly horticulture gave way to speculation on neighbors' affairs. She had met Mr. Fothergill only once years ago, and recalled him as a tall, taciturn man who had served in India and returned a widower. That he still inspired gossip, despite rarely being seen in public, was proof that absence only intensified interest in a village like Maplebrook. A slight commotion by the tea room's back door caused several heads to turn. A young woman stood there, tall, with wind-tousled hair and the slightly disheveled air of someone not used to afternoon teas. She wore a practical green dress and sensible boots, and held in her hand a canvas bag, from which a corner of a sketch-pad peeked. "Oh, look," said Miss Blackwood brightly, rising with her usual polish. "Everyone, this is Miss Iris Lockwood." She's staying at the Hollow while she works on her painting. I invited her to join us today. Do come in, dear." Miss Lockwood gave a small, embarrassed wave and took a seat near the far end of the table, nodding politely to the gathered ladies. She seemed wary of the attention, but accepted the teacup handed to her with a soft word of thanks. "She's painting the chapel ruin near Brook Hollow," whispered Mrs. Munsell to Miss Marple. "Very picturesque, of course, but you'd think a girl might brush her hair for tea. Perhaps she prefers to see the world as it is," Miss Marple said mildly, her eyes lingering on the girl's hands, roughened slightly by charcoal or ink. "I do hope you find the village inspiring." "Miss Lockwood," said Letitia Blackwood graciously, "though I must warn you we're not quite as sleepy as we look." The remark drew polite laughter, but Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. Something in the hostess's voice, just a flicker too light, did not ring true. The conversation resumed, now peppered with occasional questions to Miss Lockwood about her artistic interests. She answered politely but guardedly, revealing little about her past or her purpose in Maplebrook. Then, as the sun dipped behind the elm trees and cast long shadows across the patio, the sound of raised voices drifted through the open kitchen window. It was sudden and jarring enough to silence the entire table. "Letitia, I won't stand for it." A man's voice barked sharp and angry. There was a pause. Then Miss Blackwood's voice, calm but cold. "Lower your voice. This is neither the time nor the place." A teacup clinked as someone set it down a shade too forcefully. Miss Marple, her face politely blank, glanced at the kitchen door. No one came out. "Good heavens," murmured Mrs. Crane, dabbing at her collar with her handkerchief. That sounded like Mr. Denholm. "Peter Denholm?" Mrs. Munsell asked with raised eyebrows. "But isn't he?" Miss Blackwood re-emerged from the tea room a moment later, smiling as though nothing had happened. Her cheeks were slightly flushed. "Do forgive the interruption. My cousin Peter can be rather dramatic when he forgets his manners." She moved among the guests with fresh scones, deftly shifting the mood, but an undercurrent had been introduced. The ladies continued their tea, but the air held a faint tension. Miss Marple, taking a second sugar cube, said nothing, but she had noticed several things. The tremble in Letitia's hand as she poured more tea, the way Miss Lockwood had grown even more withdrawn, and the quick, subtle glance exchanged between Dorothy Munsell and Mrs. Crane. It was, in the way of such things, an elegantly strained ending to an otherwise delightful gathering. By the time the chairs were cleared and the table reset, only Miss Marple remained behind, pretending to admire the honeysuckle trellis. She did so long enough to observe Mr. Peter Denholm emerge from the rear of the tea room, stalking off down the gravel path, a dark look upon his face. He was a compact, square-shouldered man in a tweed jacket, and he moved like someone used to having doors opened and voices lowered in his presence. Miss Marple, who had known men like that before, pressed her gloved hands together. The next morning, Peter Denholm was found dead behind the tea room, his throat cut with a pruning knife, and his pocket watch stopped at 5:17. The tranquility of Maplebrook was shattered. And Jane Marple, who had come only to visit her niece and take the air, found herself once again at the quiet center of a murder that would soon reveal far more than anyone had expected. Section 2. The village reacts. By mid-morning the next day, the village of Maplebrook was thick with speculation. word of Peter Denholm's death had spread with the unnerving speed of a spring flood, washing through tidy gardens, over lace-curtained windows, and into every cottage and parlor within a 3-mile radius. The quiet hum of village life gave way to a charged murmur of disbelief, shock, and eager curiosity. He had been found by Ivy Cattermole, the tea room's part-time kitchen girl, just after 7 o'clock, while she was out to collect rosemary from the garden beds. One scream had summoned the entire household, and before the hour was up, Inspector Lennox had been summoned from the nearby town of Much Yelverton. The victim's body had been lying face down behind the lilac hedge that bordered the rear patio, his clothing soaked from the night's dew, a pruning knife embedded cleanly in his neck. His pocket watch silver with an ornate stag engraving had stopped, presumably upon impact at precisely 17 minutes past 5 at the butcher's. Mrs. Crane declared it was too clean a wound for a woman's hand, though she did not explain why a man might have done better. Mrs. Dalrymple, the postmistress, leaned across her counter and whispered to a customer that she had once heard Mr. Denholm raise his voice to Letitia Blackwood about something to do with shares, or perhaps sherries. It was hard to make out. By late morning, the Bell and Badger, the local pub, was enjoying a spike in midday custom. Retired men in caps sat hunched over their pints, pontificating with the authority only those well removed from any official duty could muster. Jealousy, muttered Harold Thripp, the former grocer, wagging his pipe at no one in particular. It's always jealousy with these things. That or inheritance. Bit neat for a jealous rage, don't you think? Replied Mr. Jolly, the undertaker, peering into his sherry with professional interest. More like a planned sort of thing. Knife to the neck, nearly surgical, they say. You'd know, said Mr. Calthorpe, the station master, with a grim chuckle at the heart of it all. The Maplebrook Tea Room was firmly shuttered, its little open for tea sign turned discreetly to face the wall. Curtains had been drawn, and Miss Blackwood was not receiving callers, which made her absence from village life all the more noticeable. Miss Marple, for her part, had taken her breakfast quietly at the home of her niece, Mrs. Elspeth Henderson, and then gone for a short walk around the green. Though she made no inquiries of her own, the village came to her, as it always did. She had learned long ago that in places, Maplebrook, silence invited speech. She stopped by the grocer's for a bit of seed cake and was informed solemnly by young Mrs. Winchell that the constable had taken away the pruning shears from the back garden. As evidence, they said, imagine Letitia's own gardening set, the ones with the green leather grips. And do they think those were the murder weapon? Miss Marple asked, peering delicately into the display of brambles and gooseberries. Well, they're missing the knife, said Mrs. Winchell, with the pride of one relaying what she assumed was privileged knowledge. And it were one of them that was found in Mr. Denholm's poor neck. Goodness, said Miss Marple, selecting a half-loaf of carrot bread. But surely anyone might have borrowed such a thing during the day? Exactly what I told Constable Pike, said Mrs. Winchell, puffing slightly. Only he's very sure someone used it intentionally, not accidentally. You can tell by the angle, apparently. They said that, the angle. Miss Marple gave a murmured thanks, paid for her bread, and stepped out into the sunlit morning, where the quiet hum of village life masked the undercurrent of rumor. That, Afternoon, Inspector Lennox held a small gathering at the vicarage, ostensibly to interview a handful of residents who had been at the tea party the day before. He was a square-jawed man in his early 50s, with thinning dark hair and the manner of someone used to brisk, tidy answers that Miss Marple was not among the first he spoke to. He had a professional fondness for interviewing the loudest gossips. First, "Well, I didn't see anything untoward," said Mrs. Crane, her hat trembling slightly as she leaned forward. But Letitia did have a certain sharpness to her tone when she returned to the table after that dreadful interruption, and she poured the tea with a shaking hand quite noticeably. "She always was a theatrical one," added Mrs. Munsell. "You don't open a tea room and charm half the men in the county without a flair for dramatics." "I don't say that as judgment, Inspector, merely as observation. Did anyone see Mr. Denholm leave the premises?" Lennox asked, scribbling in his book. "Only Miss Lockwood, perhaps," said Mrs. Crane. "She was seated near the corner, the girl with the sketch-pad. She might have seen something." "Miss Iris Lockwood," muttered the inspector. "Yes, I have her on my list." When Miss Marple's turn came, she sat gently upright in the vicar's sunroom, knitting needles at rest on her lap, and answered with her usual precision and modest restraint. "I'm afraid I saw very little, Inspector," she said. "I did." Note that Mr. Denholm appeared agitated, but then that was quite apparent to everyone. "He left through the kitchen door. I believe I heard his footsteps on the gravel. After that I paid more attention to the way Miss Blackwood resumed pouring tea, quite remarkably composed." "You noticed that?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "One tends to notice small things when one is not actively participating. At my age, one is expected to be present, but not engaged." The inspector looked at her, scribbled something, and said only, "Thank you, Miss Marple." Outside, a cool wind stirred the hedgerows. From her place on the vicar's bench, Miss Marple watched as Iris Lockwood approached the gate, her hair pulled back now and a hesitant expression in her eye. The inspector met her with a firm nod. "Miss Lockwood, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if I'd be needed," she said quietly. "I hardly knew him. Nevertheless, you were present. Perhaps you can help us with the timing. Did you see Mr. Denholm after he left?" "The kitchen?" Iris hesitated. "Not really. I saw him go out, yes, but I assumed he was leaving. I didn't see anyone follow him. Was there anyone else lingering in the garden at the time?" "I think Dorothy Munsell went to the far side of the hedge to get her shawl. She was gone for a moment, but she came back quickly." That remark was noted, but Lennox's face remained impassive. When Iris left, she passed Miss Marple without quite making eye contact. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat beside her niece in the drawing-room, the fire crackling and a plate of shortbread untouched between them. Elspeth, knitting with more frustration than focus, finally broke the silence. "Do you think Letitia did it, Aunt Jane?" Miss Marple looked up slowly. "I think Miss Blackwood is a very clever woman, but clever women are not always murderers. And murderers, I've found, are not always clever." She picked up a fallen stitch from her lap. "But I will say this, Elspeth. There is something deeply unpleasant beneath all this. It's not merely a quarrel between cousins. I believe someone wanted Mr. Denholm silenced." Elspeth shivered. "Do you think the police will arrest Letitia?" "Inspector Lennox is a capable man," Miss Marple said. sipping her tea. But like most capable men, he believes in straight lines. The world, alas, is full of curves. She turned her eyes back to the fire, the knitting resting in her lap like a puzzle, waiting to be assembled. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the ivy around the tea room's shuttered windows in the quiet that followed. Miss Marple's gaze drifted thoughtful, precise, and filled with the soft certainty that someone in Maplebrook had just made a terrible mistake. Section 3. Early investigation. The next 2 days in Maplebrook unfolded with deceptive calm. The village green remained its usual picture of serenity, children playing with hoops, the occasional barking dog, and the peal of the church bell marking the passing hours. But underneath the surface a quiet turbulence persisted, though no formal arrest had been made. Inspector Lennox's presence loomed large. His men had been seen taking statements from several residents, collecting footprints from the rear garden, and removing a small parcel of letters from the bureau in Miss Blackwood's office, all under the careful eyes of a community that prided itself on knowing everyone else's business. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with characteristic grace and unobtrusiveness. She attended a charity raffle at the village hall, paid a polite visit to the vicarage for tea, and stopped by to admire Mrs. Abbott's prized chrysanthemums. She asked few direct questions, but she heard much. It was at the charity raffle that she encountered Mrs. Dorothy Munsell again, the retired schoolmistress whose stoic demeanor had begun to show signs of strain. Miss Marple offered a few pleasant comments about the quality of the needlepoint being auctioned, and Mrs. Munsell responded with her usual clipped politeness. But as Miss Marple gently pressed on the subject of that Thursday afternoon, her tone took on a subtle edge. "You see, my dear," said Miss Marple, feigning absent-mindedness as she examined a tea cozy, "I do wonder about the moment you stepped away from the table. I thought I saw you return with your shawl, but surely it wasn't so cold?" Dorothy's expression froze just a fraction too long. "Oh, yes. I suppose it wasn't cold exactly, but the breeze had picked up. My joints don't take well to wind." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple nodded. "Though I must admit, it seemed to me that Miss Iris Lockwood was shivering more than most, and she didn't fetch hers." Dorothy's lips thinned. "That girl is strange, moody. You'd think she was posing for one of her own portraits, the way she drifts about." Miss Marple said nothing more, but the small furrow between her brows deepened. She had noticed the very same tendency, but also the self-effacing anxiety behind it. A girl with something to hide, perhaps, but not necessarily a murderer. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat beneath the sycamore tree in the vicarage garden, sipping tea with the vicar's wife, Lavinia Crane. The breeze carried the scent of lavender from a nearby bush and the occasional chirp of a wren. "It's terribly unsettling," said Lavinia, adjusting her shawl. "You know, Letitia used to be so confident, always had a clever remark ready. But now there's something quite withdrawn about her. Not fear, exactly. Almost as if she's bracing for something." "Guilt or grief," Miss Marple said softly. "Or the knowledge that she is being watched." Lavinia hesitated, then leaned in. "You know, she and Mr. Denholm didn't see eye to eye, not since last year. He invested in the tea room initially, back when she converted the old grocer's. But after a while he became difficult, demanding." "Demanding? In what way?" "Well," Lavinia glanced around, lowering her voice, "there were whispers, of course. Some said he had financial troubles, others believed he tried to, well, attach himself more firmly to her. You mean marriage? I wouldn't say that exactly, said Lavinia, clearly wishing she had. Only that he may have had expectations. And Letitia didn't take kindly to being cornered. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She doesn't strike one as a woman who enjoys being cornered. Quite. At that moment the vicar appeared with a letter in hand. Just ran into young Iris Lockwood, actually, he said, offering the envelope to his wife. She seemed flustered. Said she's heading back to London next week. Really? Lavinia raised her brows. How sudden. Yes, she didn't elaborate. But she did ask whether she could borrow a prayer book from the chapel. Said she finds peace in old things. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. How? Curious. I've always found the living more distressing than the dead. She returned to her niece's cottage that evening with her mind alight. The pattern of behavior was forming, delicate and incomplete, like the first stitches of a complicated lace doily. Mr. Denholm had been unpopular, at least privately. Letitia Blackwood had reason to feel cornered, and her calm demeanor after. The murder was either a testament to her nerves or her calculation. Miss Munsell had lied subtly, but lied nonetheless. Iris Lockwood was fleeing, though she had no obvious connection to the crime. And yet something did not sit right. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple made her way toward the edge of the village where the old chapel ruins stood. The path was quiet, save for the crunch of pebbles beneath her shoes and the occasional flutter of bird wings. She paused at the edge of the copse and peered through the iron gate, where wild ivy clung to the chapel stones and lichen had overtaken much of the old pews. Figure was seated near the crumbling altar. Miss Lockwood, sketchbook in hand. She had not seen Miss Marple approach. You find solace here? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, even conversational. Iris startled slightly, then composed herself. Yes, it's quiet. I can think here. You must miss London terribly. I expect. All the noise and motion. Sometimes, said Iris, turning a page. But it's not so different, really. People are the same. Miss Marple's gaze lingered. You left quickly at the end of the gathering. I imagine it must have been rather upsetting, especially the argument. Iris hesitated. I didn't know him well. I wasn't used to that sort of tension. Few people are, Miss Marple murmured. Did you ever sketch Mr. Denholm? What? Iris blinked. No, why would I? I only wondered. Artists often find inspiration in faces. And I've noticed you're very perceptive. Iris looked down. I've drawn Letitia once. She asked me not to keep it. Did she now? Miss Marple tilted her head. And why do you think that was? Iris's voice dropped. Maybe she didn't like what she saw. There it was, an odd admission, and one that settled uneasily in Miss Marple's chest. I do hope you'll stay through the weekend, Miss Marple said gently, standing. I've always found that decisions made in haste are often revisited with regret. As she walked back along the lane, twilight falling around her, Miss Marple reflected on the pieces still scattered. She was certain now that someone was lying, not just about where they'd been, but about who they really were. There had been a tension between Peter Denholm and Letitia Blackwood, yes. But there was something deeper, a network of secrets, quietly knotted over time, hidden under the surface of small talk and jam tarts. Someone had acted not in passion, but with intent. The pruning knife had not been wielded in anger. It had been selected. She reached the cottage, the lights glowing warmly from within, and took her seat by the hearth. The fire crackled, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender polish. Her knitting rested in her lap. Untouched, the lace pattern was forming, and soon, very soon, she would see where the flaw in the design began. Section 4. First Suspects by. The third morning after the murder, the prevailing mood in Maplebrook had shifted from shock to quiet suspicion. Neighbors who once traded garden cuttings now traded sidelong glances. Behind the picket fences and lace curtains, speculation fermented into certainty, for nearly everyone now believed that Letitia Blackwood had murdered her cousin. The case, as many villagers saw it, was uncomfortably neat. Motive, means, and opportunity were all hers. She had been overheard arguing with Peter Denholm not once, but twice in the past fortnight. She owned the set of gardening tools from which the murder weapon had come. And worst of all, she had remained behind at the tea room after most guests had gone unaccompanied and unaccounted for. Inspector Lennox, for his part, had begun to formalize the investigation. He returned that morning to the tea room with Constable Pike, and this time they were seen carrying a box of receipts and a ledger out to the motor car. Not long after, a handwritten notice was tacked to the oak door of the tea room, informing the public that it would be closed until further notice. Miss Marple stood quietly outside the baker's when she saw it, her face unreadable under the soft brim of her hat. She didn't go up to the door. There would be no point now. Letitia Blackwood had retreated from public view entirely. Inside the bakery, a queue of villagers murmured in hushed tones, their words rising above the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread. "They'll arrest her before Sunday. Mark my words," said Mrs. Dalrymple, weighing a half-dozen currant buns in a paper bag. "It's the money, isn't it?" replied Arthur Bell, the cobbler. She owed Denholm more than she let on. Man came sniffing around about repayment just last week. Got a solicitor's letter, apparently. Mrs. Crane leaned across the counter with gleaming eyes. "And did you hear she canceled the order for new drapes? That was before the murder. Now, if that doesn't say desperation." Miss Marple purchased a modest sultana loaf and made no comment. That afternoon, at the edge of the village green, Inspector Lennox summoned Dorothy Munsell and Miss Marple together for a clarification of statements. It was to be an informal conversation, he explained, merely a matter of tying up inconsistencies. They gathered in the drawing-room of the vicarage, where the ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound apart from the scrape of the inspector's pen against paper. "Miss Munsell," he began, "you mentioned previously that you stepped away from the table to collect your shawl from the hedge. Roughly what time was this?" "Just before 5, Dorothy replied, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I recall because I glanced at the tea-room clock when I stood up." "And you were gone for how long?" "A minute, perhaps 2. "You returned and sat down?" "Yes." "Did you see Mr. Denholm again after that?" She paused. "No. Not after he left the kitchen." The inspector looked to Miss Marple. "You recall this?" "I recall Miss Munsell rising," said Miss Marple, "though I don't recall her stating her reason aloud at the time. She returned quickly, certainly." "But not from the direction of the hedge," the inspector murmured, eyes narrowing. Dorothy's lips parted slightly. "What are you implying?" "Nothing, Miss Munsell. Simply that the hedge where you claimed to have left your shawl was not the one you were seen returning from. Miss Marple watched the flush rise in the woman's cheeks. I was restless, Dorothy said stiffly. I walked a short loop around the back garden to clear my head. The breeze was stiff. It helped. Lennox jotted something down, but said no more. When they left, Miss Marple walked with Dorothy part way to her cottage, both moving slowly down the pebbled lane. You don't trust him, Dorothy said suddenly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Inspector Lennox is a capable man, but I believe he is following the most visible thread, not necessarily the strongest one. You think Letitia is innocent. I think she is not yet proven guilty. Dorothy gave a small, dry laugh. Then you're in the minority. The whole village has decided she did it. Villages are quick to pass judgment, Miss Marple said gently. I've seen it many times, but they are not always correct. They see what they expect. Dorothy's gaze flicked away. And what do you see? Patterns. Inconsistencies. People behaving unlike themselves. There was silence as they walked a few more steps. I didn't kill him, Dorothy said quietly, without looking over. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. I believe you, but I do think you're hiding something. And secrets, Miss Munsell, have a way of clouding investigations. They parted shortly after, but the encounter left Miss Marple thoughtful. Dorothy Munsell was not a woman prone to emotional reaction, yet beneath her steely exterior, Miss Marple had sensed something close to fear. Later that evening, Inspector Lennox arrived at Mrs. Henderson's cottage just after supper. Miss Marple received him in the parlor, where the lamplight glowed softly against the floral wallpaper, and the mantel clock ticked like a gentle heartbeat. I wanted to keep you apprised, he said. We've traced financial records from the tea room. Mr. Denholm had extended 2 private loans to Miss Blackwood in the past 18 months. The second was due last month. She never repaid it. Were there threats? Miss Marple asked. No direct ones, but Denholm visited a solicitor in Much Yelverton last week. We believe he intended to take legal action to assume partial control of the business. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. And now that option is closed. Lennox studied her. You're not convinced? I never said that. No, but you've seen things I haven't. You listen in a way most people don't, and you never waste your words. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Thank you, Inspector. That is rare praise from an officer of the law. He stood to leave, then hesitated. Letitia Blackwood refuses to answer further questions without a solicitor. I don't believe that's guilt, but it's certainly fear. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts circling. Later that night, she removed a lace napkin from her drawer the one Letitia had embroidered by hand for the tea room's opening. The stitches were beautiful, but one corner was slightly misaligned, an almost invisible imperfection. The whole case, she thought, was like that napkin, seemingly complete, but hiding a flaw in its pattern. The village had accepted Letitia as the killer because she fit the narrative. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that real guilt was never so obliging. And even now, she had begun to wonder about Iris Lockwood, not because she seemed suspicious, but because she seemed too distant. She was always on the fringe, always listening, always escaping scrutiny, and she had a sketch she'd once been asked to destroy. Miss Marple folded the napkin back into the drawer and blew out the candle by her bedside. The truth She knew would not lie quietly for long. Section 5. A hidden clue. It was the following morning, crisp, cool, and touched with mist, that brought Miss Marple her first truly significant clue. Not the kind that Inspector Lennox preferred: documents, receipts, footprints, fingerprints, but something much finer, more delicate. The sort of clue that others dismissed because it didn't look like one at all. The clue came, rather oddly, wrapped around a jar of raspberry preserve. She had stopped by the vicarage garden fete, where a modest table had been set out by the Women's Auxiliary to raise funds for church roof repairs. There were knitted egg cozies, hand-painted bookmarks, and 3 kinds of homemade jams: plum, damson, and raspberry, all lined up like soldiers on parade. Miss Marple had been reaching for a jar of the raspberry preserve when her eyes fell on something curious. The label was wrong. Not glaringly wrong, not misspelled or upside down, but wrong all the same. It had been written in the same tidy script as the others, but slightly more slanted, and instead of being centered on the jar, it was applied at a noticeable angle. More importantly, the jar's wax seal was a dull crimson, not the clear rose-pink color that Mrs. Crane, who always made the preserves, had been using for years. "Isn't that one of yours, Lavinia?" Miss Marple asked, gesturing gently toward the misaligned jar. Mrs. Crane, already distracted by a lace doily that wouldn't sit flat, barely looked up. "Oh, not that one, dear. That was brought in by Miss Lockwood. Said she had an old recipe she wanted to contribute. Seemed harmless enough." "Very kind of her," said Miss Marple, taking the jar carefully in hand. She smiled, paid her 6pence, and tucked it neatly into her reticule. But her thoughts were already a dozen steps ahead. Back at her niece's cottage, she placed the jar on the kitchen table and studied it under proper light. The wax seal was uneven, not sloppily so, but different in texture, thicker. She took a butter knife and prized it gently off. Inside, the preserve smelled perfectly respectable, sweet, tart. No sign of spoilage. But Miss Marple wasn't interested in the preserve. She was interested in what had been used to seal it. She ran a fingertip over the inside of the lid. The texture was slightly granular, gritty in a way raspberry seeds never were. She dabbed a touch of the wax onto a saucer, added a drop of warm water, and watched as the surface shimmered, then released a faint purplish hue. "I thought so," she murmured, a trick she'd once seen during her visit to a girls' school in Leicestershire came to mind, where the art mistress had taught the girls how to tint sealing wax with powdered pastels for decoration. But she'd also warned them, never use charcoal-based pencil dust. It stains too deeply and dries too slowly. Miss Marple held the lid to the light. Embedded in the wax were tiny black specks, not fruit seeds, but charcoal dust, the sort used in sketching. Which meant this jar hadn't been sealed using wax for preserving at all, but with something meant to mimic it, for appearance's sake. But why? What purpose could there be in sealing a jar of jam improperly? Unless, of course, the jar wasn't really about jam at all. She didn't need to open the preserve further. She had already seen what she needed. Miss Marple folded a handkerchief over the jar, slipped it into her bag, and walked into the square with a new resolve. Her first stop was not to the constable or the inspector, but to Miss Iris Lockwood herself. The young woman had been unusually quiet these past 2 days, seen sketching by the brook, eating alone at the hollow, and declining every social invitation offered her. When Miss Marple arrived at the small thatched cottage where Iris was staying, the girl answered the door with a faint expression of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple, is something wrong?" "Not at all, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and warm. "I've just brought something I thought might belong to you." She held out the jar, neatly wrapped, as though it were a thoughtful gift. "I believe this was part of your contribution to the fete?" Iris looked at it. Her hesitation lasted no more than 2 seconds, but Miss Marple was watching closely, and she did not miss the faint tremor in the girl's fingers as she took it. Yes, I made several. Is something the matter?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said lightly. "Only I noticed the seal was quite unusual. I thought perhaps you were experimenting with an artistic touch." There was a pause. "I suppose I was," said Iris. I hadn't made preserves in a long time. My grandmother used to do it. I tried to remember how it was done." Miss Marple's tone softened. "I imagine things are difficult, Miss Lockwood, especially now." Iris's eyes dropped. "Why are you here, really?" "To help, if I can, but also to understand. I don't think you killed Peter Denholm, but I do think you know something about him, something you haven't shared." The young woman's shoulders tensed. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." A moment passed. The wind picked up slightly, fluttering a curtain behind her. "I drew him," Iris said at last, "the day before he died. He asked me to. I didn't want to, but he insisted. Said he needed it for something about his legacy. He wanted a portrait that showed him as commanding. That was his word." Miss Marple waited. "When I showed him the sketch," Iris continued, "he flew into a rage. Said I'd made him look weak, petty. Said I had seen through him. I told him I only drew what I saw." "And what did you see, Miss Lockwood?" "A man used to power, but not respect. Someone who confused intimidation with admiration. He wanted to be feared because he couldn't be loved." "And that made him angry?" "Yes, furious. He tore the drawing in half and told me I had no idea what he was capable of." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "And what did you do with the pieces?" I pasted them into the bottom of the jam jars. I was going to burn them, but I didn't want anyone to find them in the bin. I thought if I sealed them under the jam, no one would ever look." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "I think it's time you showed those to the inspector." "I didn't kill him," Iris said quickly, eyes wide. "I was scared, that's all. I've never been involved in anything like this." "I believe you," said Miss Marple kindly. "But fear, dear, is very near to silence, and silence, as you've seen, can be terribly loud." That evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Lennox in the vicar's study and quietly unfolded the truth she had found. The inspector examined the jar, his expression unreadable, then turned to the sketch fragments Iris Lockwood had finally delivered. One half showed Denholm's eyes, sharp and narrowed, drawn with unflattering precision. The other his hand gripping what looked like a heavy paper, a contract or letter. Miss Marple leaned in. "That," she said, pointing to the corner of the sheet, "is not a fictional detail. It's his solicitor's letter, the same one you mentioned. She had seen it, likely before anyone else. The inspector nodded slowly. That would explain her fear. She knew he planned to humiliate Letitia, to take her business, perhaps ruin her reputation. But she said nothing, for fear she would be drawn in. He glanced up. And now? Now she's told the truth, or as much as she can manage. He folded the drawings back into their envelope. It doesn't clear Letitia, though. No, Miss Marple said softly, but it clouds the certainty. Outside, the village square lay bathed in lamplight, calm and still. But the pattern of human behavior had shifted yet again. One piece had been found, and Miss Marple knew the next would not be far behind. Section 6. Confrontations and secret. By the end of the week, the rhythm of life in Maplebrook had shifted once more, though the familiar pattern of daily routine had not returned. Beneath the comforting veil of village normalcy, the undercurrents of suspicion and unease had deepened, threading their way through conversations and creaking floorboards alike. Miss Marple observed all this from her usual post by the front window of her niece Elspeth's cottage, knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the villagers come and go. Every encounter she had in the days since discovering the false jam seal only confirmed what she already suspected. Someone in Maplebrook was holding back more than fear or grief. Someone was hiding a dangerous truth. And that morning, something peculiar happened. At precisely 10:15, Miss Dorothy Munsell stormed into the vicarage garden, hat askew, her walking stick jabbing furiously at the gravel. She had not requested a meeting with the vicar's wife, nor had she brought any of her usual lemon biscuits. This was not a social call. Miss Marple, seated by the hydrangeas and conversing quietly with Mrs. Crane about rose pruning, watched the scene unfold with subtle interest. Dorothy and Lavinia Crane exchanged brief words, and then Dorothy was ushered through the side door into the drawing room, her face set in grim determination. The vicar's wife returned some 10 minutes later, looking distinctly flushed. "Poor woman," Lavinia said softly to Miss Marple as she resumed her seat. "She's terribly upset about something. She's tired of being blamed by implication." Miss Marple nodded, hurling thoughtfully. "One always knows when Miss Munsell feels cornered. She jabs at truth like a hen at a worm, quick and violent." Indeed, it was not long before Dorothy's reaction set the village abuzz again. That afternoon she made a public appearance at the green market, carefully inspecting apples, and then loudly declaring that she had nothing to hide, and that some people would do well to look to their own hearths before casting stones. Mrs. Dalrymple remarked, with no small relish, that only someone hiding something would feel the need to say such a thing aloud. Meanwhile, Letitia Blackwood remained secluded within her shuttered tea room, having made no public statement, nor sought a solicitor, despite the inspector's request for a formal interview. Her silence was beginning to weigh more heavily than her words might have, but Miss Marple, ever attuned to the quieter currents of behavior, was far more intrigued by another matter altogether, the reappearance of Mr. Arthur Bell's nephew, James. Bell, a lanky young man with ruddy cheeks and a tendency to stammer when nervous, had left Maplebrook nearly 5 years earlier under something of a cloud. The reason for his departure had never been spoken aloud in polite company, but it was generally understood that his relationship with a married shop assistant had caused unpleasantness. He now worked in Eastbourne at a modest bookbindery, and yet he was back. Miss Marple noticed him by chance while passing the post office. He had emerged from the alley near the back of the building, where the tea room's rear garden fence bordered a narrow lane. His coat was wrinkled, his shoes muddy, and most interestingly, he did not look surprised to see her. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, smiling too quickly. "Didn't expect to see you about." "Then you underestimate the power of a good walk," she replied amiably. "I often find answers to questions I hadn't yet thought to ask." He gave a nervous chuckle. "You've returned home for the weekend?" Yes. Just to see Uncle Arthur, really. He's not well." "Ah, I'm sorry to hear it, but I'm glad you've come." She let the moment stretch just slightly longer than was comfortable. "I wonder," she added, "did you perhaps know Mr. Denholm?" His smile faded. "Not personally. No? He invested in the tea room. Surely you crossed paths at some point?" James hesitated. "Maybe once or twice. I honestly don't remember." Miss Marple smiled politely and moved on, but the encounter lingered in her mind. James Bell had lied. She was certain of it, and she could guess why. The following day brought another development. Inspector Lennox, now visibly weary from the mounting pressure of the case, came to speak with Miss Marple at the church garden, where she was planting spring bulbs. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "We've just learned something odd," he said. "Denholm made a cash withdrawal of nearly £200 3 days before his death. The money is unaccounted for." "Unusual," Miss Marple murmured, "and highly specific. It suggests a transaction, possibly a payment blackmail, maybe. Or he was planning to purchase something off record. Or pay someone," Miss Marple said softly. Lennox's gaze sharpened. "You're thinking something?" She nodded, brushing earth from her gloves. "I believe Mr. Denholm may have been engaged in something clandestine, though not romantic. Financial, perhaps, or reputational. And who was he paying? I couldn't say yet. But I wonder, Inspector, has anyone searched the rear fence of the tea room? The side that backs onto the alley? We did. Nothing notable. Not recently, I think." He tilted his head. "Denholm wasn't killed on a whim. The knife was selected, and the timing was precise. But it also suggests someone who knew his movements intimately. Someone who either worked at the tea room or had access through the back." "James Bell," Lennox muttered. "He had motive," Miss Marple continued. "He left under a cloud. I suspect Denholm knew something about his departure, or his conduct while he worked here, and perhaps he threatened to reveal it. A man like Denholm wouldn't think twice about such leverage." Lennox straightened. "If we can place James at the scene—" "Ask Mrs. Winchell," Miss Marple said. "She cleans for his uncle. She may know more than she realizes." By twilight, Inspector Lennox had taken statements from both Arthur Bell and Mrs. Winchell. The pieces began to shift. James had arrived 2 days earlier than he claimed, and had not stayed with his uncle the entire time. He'd borrowed a key to the back gate of the tea room to help with deliveries, though no one had seen him actually make any. And most damning of all, he had been spotted late Thursday afternoon, loitering in the lane behind the tea room, roughly 15 minutes before Denholm was killed. But before Lennox could act, James vanished. He was not at the Bell residence, nor had he boarded the train to Eastbourne. A small satchel of his belongings was missing. The rest were left behind, dotted. Was the first sign of true fear in the case. Not guilt, perhaps, but panic. And panic, Miss Marple knew, meant something vital had been uncovered. That evening, Letitia Blackwood finally broke her silence. She arrived at the vicarage unannounced, her face pale but composed. Her voice, when she spoke, was firm. "I didn't kill Peter," she said, "but I do know why someone might have." Inspector Lennox said nothing, only nodded for her to go on. "He was blackmailing someone. Not me, though I feared he might. He was after Dorothy Munsell." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Dorothy?" Lennox repeated. Letitia nodded. "I saw them once in the back garden arguing. Peter had something on her. I don't know what, but she looked broken. She begged him to stay quiet. After that, she was never the same." "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I was afraid I was next. He hinted he had dirt on me too false, I believe, but enough to ruin me if aired. I said nothing because I didn't want to be dragged into it." Miss Marple watched her carefully. There was no performance in Letitia's voice, only weariness. Lennox took down the statement, but the questions were multiplying. Blackmail, a vanished suspect, a secret held by a respected schoolmistress. The threads were tightening, and Miss Marple, seated once more in the quiet of her niece's parlor that night, began to see the outline of a story that went far deeper than anyone had guessed. Section 7. Another twist. The morning mist clung low over Maplebrook, casting the cottages and hedgerows in a dreamy pallor, as though the village were holding its breath. By now, the townsfolk were used to the tension, the gentle dread of waiting for something else to break the silence. And on that seventh morning, something did dot at 7:15. Mrs. Winchell, the Bell family's housekeeper, rushed breathlessly to Constable Pike's door, apron still stained with eggs and ash. Her voice, when she spoke, was sharp with fear. "Arthur Bell's been attacked," she gasped. "He's still breathing, but he's been struck, and the back door was wide open." Within the hour, Inspector Lennox had taken over the small parlor of the Bell residence, now turned into a makeshift sick-room. The elder Mr. Bell lay on the sofa, a bandage wrapped around his temple. His breathing was shallow but steady, and though he drifted in and out of consciousness, he managed to say just enough. "Something in the kitchen," he whispered. "Heard the latch. Thought it was James, but it wasn't. Taller, broader." "Did you recognize them, Mr. Bell?" Lennox asked, crouching low beside him. Arthur blinked slowly. "Didn't see face, just shadows." The inspector cursed under his breath. Whoever it was, they didn't steal anything. Then they weren't. "After valuables," Miss Marple murmured. She had arrived 10 minutes after the inspector, claiming concern for an old friend, but was now observing the scene with her usual composed detachment. "No," Lennox said. "They were after silence." Miss Marple nodded. "And now we know. Someone is desperate enough to silence an old man recovering from heart trouble. That suggests the danger is far from past." Outside, the village square was already stirring with gossip. Word of the attack on Mr. Bell spread like spilled tea, swift and impossible to recover. Every face held a question. Every whisper curved back to the same old names: Letitia Blackwood, Dorothy Munsell, Iris Lockwood, and now James Bell. But James was still missing, and the longer he remained unseen, the more likely it seemed that he had either run for his life or was no longer in possession of it. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced by either theory. That afternoon, she paid an unannounced visit to the post office, where Mabel Hitchens, the postmistress, was tidying her stamps. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," Mabel said. "Dreadful business, isn't it?" "Quite," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Though I wondered if you could help me with something quite unrelated. I was hoping to find a missing letter. Something sent in haste. Perhaps a young man trying to make contact." Mabel frowned thoughtfully. "We've had 2 express parcels this week, both paid in cash. One went to London addressed to a James F. Bell. No return address. The other was local, but that one was from Miss Lockwood. She sends things to her art school in Chelsea from time to time. May I see the log?" Mabel obliged. The parcel to James Bell had been posted the morning after the murder, quietly, discreetly, and it had been collected by a driver, not dropped in the box. "Very kind of you, Mabel," Miss Marple said with a smile, making a careful note in her. "Mind, if James Bell had been receiving parcels, then someone knew where he was. Someone who hadn't come forward. Miss Marple's next stop was the home of Iris Lockwood. The artist opened the door slowly, her face pale as though sleep had not been kind to her. Her hands were smudged with charcoal, and her hair was pinned hastily. "I wasn't expecting anyone," she said, her voice hollow. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said. "But I must ask you plainly, are you hiding James Bell?" Iris stared. "No, of course not." "Then why send him a parcel after the murder?" The young woman flinched. "How do you know that?" "I pay attention, and I ask kind people careful questions." "What was in the parcel?" "A sketch, Iris admitted after a long pause. "A portrait I did of Letitia. Before everything changed. Why send it to James? He asked me for it. He said he wanted to make something right." Sighed. Denholm had threatened to expose Letitia to ruin her in the village. James believed if people saw her through my eyes, maybe they'd remember who she really was. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained measured. "Miss Lockwood, are you in contact with him?" "No," Iris said, but her voice trembled. Miss Marple studied her. "If you are, please encourage him to come forward. The danger he feared may no longer be the one he faces. Someone has struck Mr. Bell, and it may not be the last attempt." After a moment's silence, Iris closed the door quietly. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple relayed her discoveries to Inspector Lennox. "You think James knows more than he's told," he said, pacing the study. "And someone else is cleaning up the pieces." "I think James is a thread," Miss Marple said. "Not the hand that wielded the knife. But he may have seen that hand or been near enough to guess its owner." "Then what do you suggest?" "I believe the key is Dorothy Munsell." The inspector turned. "Still?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Letitia mentioned Peter Denholm was blackmailing her. We haven't asked the most important question about what. You think it's more than money?" "I think it's a secret she's protected for years, and one Denholm discovered. By accident." "Go on." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Years ago, when James Bell left Maplebrook, it wasn't entirely his doing. He was involved with a woman, yes, but he wasn't the aggressor. He was a boy. She was older." Lennox blinked. "Dorothy?" "She was his teacher. He was 17. She resigned from the school shortly after." and Denholm found out possibly from a misplaced letter or a whisper from someone else. He used it, Lennox exhaled, and she'd do anything to keep that buried. Miss Marple nodded. Anything, including helping someone else do what she couldn't. You think she helped Letitia? Not Letitia. Someone more reckless. James? No. I believe Dorothy's guilt has turned into protection. I think she's shielding someone she believes she's already harmed once. And it may be that the attacker of Arthur Bell wasn't James at all, but someone else trying to frame him. Then who? Miss Marple's eyes were very calm. There's one person in this village who knows all the players, who has access to keys, who has moved freely between homes, watched people, taken notes, and no one suspects him because he's part of the background. Who? She didn't answer. Not yet. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and stood by the fire, her thoughts distant. Elspeth entered holding a note. Post just arrived. This one's for you. Miss Marple opened it. Inside, a torn fragment of paper bearing a single phrase. It wasn't supposed to go that far. No name, no envelope. Delivered by hand. The handwriting was neat, familiar, and very, very frightened. She folded the note slowly. It had begun. The final test. Section 8. Miss Marple's final test. By the next morning, the air in Maplebrook had changed. Again quieter now, but not calmer. It was a hush that came before revelation. Miss Marple could feel it in her bones. She rose early and spent the morning in her niece Elspeth's sitting room, seemingly at peace with her embroidery while the kettle bubbled on the stove. But behind the calm facade her mind ticked with the slow precision of a METRONOME. She had received the note short, cryptic, and terrified. The handwriting, though disguised in simplicity, was undoubtedly male. And the words, it wasn't supposed to go that far. A confession of sorts. Or perhaps a cry for help. She no longer believed James Bell had committed the murder, nor had Letitia Blackwood. Dorothy Munsell's secret, however damning, now appeared to be a parallel thread, a motive tangled with shame, but not blood. The murder itself had the sharpness of panic, not long-planned revenge. A confrontation had turned fatal, and the cover-up that followed had only deepened the darkness. That morning, Miss Marple sent out a quiet invitation. By noon, 4 people were expected to take tea at Elspeth's cottage. Letitia Blackwood, Dorothy Munsell, Iris Lockwood, and crucially Mr. Giles Channing, the local notary and solicitor. Mr. Channing was a fixture in the village, quiet and courteous, with the air of someone who preferred paper to people. He had drawn up wills, mediated disputes, and attended every public gathering with a modest smile and a notebook always to hand. He was not widely liked or disliked, simply present, which in villages like Maplebrook often meant invisible. He had also been Denholm's solicitor. And Miss Marple suspected he had used that position to devastating advantage. They gathered in the parlor just before 3:30. Letitia was the first to arrive, nervous but composed, wearing a charcoal gray dress and carrying a small box of carrot shortbread. She greeted Elspeth politely, then settled into the corner chair with the quiet dignity of someone wrongly accused. Dorothy Munsell came next, lips pinched, her every motion tight with tension. She refused tea, instead choosing to stand by the hearth, staring at the unlit coals as though they might spring to life and cleanse her memory. Iris Lockwood arrived soon after, looking pale and tired, her coat unbuttoned, her sketchbook still clutched in one gloved hand. Then, at exactly 3:30, Mr. Giles Channing entered the room. He was the picture of formality, with pressed cuffs and polished shoes, but his eyes were cautious. He smiled at Miss Marple in that slightly condescending way men sometimes used when speaking to elderly women. She returned it warmly, her eyes twinkling with something far deeper than gratitude. The tea was poured. Biscuits were passed. Conversation remained light. Miss Marple, seated near the small table by the window, began gently. "I do hope none of you mind being gathered like this. There's such uncertainty still about poor Mr. Denholm, and I rather thought we might benefit from reflection." The group murmured politely. No one objected. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued, stirring her tea with slow deliberation, "about the sort of man Peter Denholm was. So ambitious, so confident in his control over people. And yet he didn't quite understand the power of fear. He assumed people would do as he wished simply because they had done so before." Dorothy glanced toward her, quickly looking away. "But fear," Miss Marple said, "is a strange thing. It makes people bold. It makes them reckless. And sometimes it makes them dangerous." She took a sip, then set her cup down and turned to Mr. Channing. "Giles, dear, I understand Peter Denholm had a will drafted recently. A new one?" Channing nodded, his voice smooth. "Indeed. Less than 2 weeks before his death. I have the original, of course." "And it benefited whom, exactly?" "His sister's children, primarily. A small sum was designated for the tea room, but nothing extravagant." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That's interesting. I had heard, through Letitia, that Peter had threatened to take partial ownership of the tea room as compensation for her debts." "Yes, well, such arrangements aren't always reflected in formal wills," Channing said, a bit stiffly. "They may have been negotiating separate terms." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. That makes sense." She let the conversation drift, then turned to Dorothy. "Miss Munsell, do you recall when Peter came to visit you last month? I imagine it wasn't a pleasant exchange." Dorothy paled. "I'd prefer not to discuss it." "No doubt, but I believe it's important. Because Peter Denholm had a pattern. He found people's secrets and leaned on them politely, of course, always with plausible deniability." Letitia's hands curled in her lap. Iris said nothing, eyes downcast. Miss Marple pressed gently. "He used Giles for many of these dealings. Isn't that right?" There was a pause. Channing laughed softly. "Well, I wouldn't say used. He was my client." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "But it would be difficult not to notice things. Old property deeds, family scandals, even informal agreements not recorded officially." Channing blinked, then shrugged. "That's the nature of the profession." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice still light, almost grandmotherly. "I imagined, then, that you knew James Bell had been left a small inheritance by his great-aunt. He never claimed it, likely never knew, but Peter did. And I imagine he instructed you to withhold the detail until it was convenient." Channing's smile faltered. "That's a rather serious suggestion, Miss Marple." "Oh, I've made no suggestion," she replied brightly. "Merely an observation. After all, you were one of the last people to speak with Peter before his death. and the only one besides James who knew he was planning to meet someone in the back garden of the tea room that evening. Silence fell. Iris looked up sharply. Letitia stared at Dot. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, then continued softly. Peter Denholm trusted the wrong man. I believe he intended to cut you out of his affairs entirely, Giles. Perhaps he'd uncovered something fraud, maybe. Or perhaps you simply grew tired of being the errand boy to a man who thought himself superior. Either way, the confrontation turned violent. Channing set his teacup down very slowly. You have no proof of this. Not quite, Miss Marple said, but I do have your note. It wasn't supposed to go that far. His eyes widened. You see, she went on, you've been watching closely. Listening. You even followed James to his uncle's house after the murder. You knew Arthur Bell suspected something, and when you realized James might return, you panicked. So you silenced the old man. Dorothy gasped softly. Iris rose halfway from her seat. Channing stood too, his voice tight. This is absurd. But Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. You followed a pattern, Mr. Channing, a quiet one. You kept yourself small, unobtrusive. But in every secret that Denholm discovered, you saw opportunity. Until he became a threat himself. Then you acted not with malice, but with something more dangerous. Wounded pride. Lennox, who had been waiting just outside the room, stepped in then. Constable Pike behind him. Mr. Channing stiffened. I suggest you come quietly. The inspector said that the solicitor looked at each face in the room. Letitia, trembling. Iris white with shock. Dorothy watching with something like horror, and then at Miss Marple. Calm as snowfall. He said nothing, only lowered his head and followed them out. That evening, the fire crackled gently in Elspeth's parlor as Miss Marple returned to her knitting. A solicitor? Elspeth murmured. Who would have thought? People who are always listening often hear what they should not, Miss Marple replied. And men like Mr. Channing are dangerous precisely because no one notices them. But how did you know? Miss Marple smiled softly. Because he forgot something very simple. Villages notice patterns, but they also notice what changes. Mr. Channing had never once brought sweets to a gathering, but that day at the fete he donated a jar of raspberry preserve. I found the matching wax on the note he sent me. Elspeth blinked. So he wrote the note? Yes. A guilty conscience rarely stays silent. She held up her knitting. A single dropped stitch, corrected so expertly it could barely be seen. Pattern was almost perfect, she said. But a real eye can always tell. Section 9. The reveal the day after Mr. Giles Channing was taken into custody. Maplebrook woke to a fragile hush. Not the heavy tension that had weighed upon the village since Peter Denholm's death, but a different kind of stillness, one born of relief and uncertainty, and the slow unspooling of questions that had not yet been answered. People lingered. In doorways, speaking in lowered voices. Shopkeepers took longer to wrap parcels. Even the birdsong seemed more tentative. Miss Marple, however, moved through the day as gently and cheerfully as she ever had. She sent for more knitting wool from the haberdashery. She called on Reverend Arkwright with a modest pot of lemon curd, and in the afternoon she invited Inspector Lennox to tea. He arrived promptly at 4, still in uniform but without the hard set to his jaw he had worn for the past fortnight. I must admit, he said as he accepted a cup of Darjeeling. "This case was a tangle, and I wouldn't have pulled the final thread without your help." Miss Marple smiled demurely. "I've always found that when one listens long enough, people tend to show you exactly who they are." Channing was careful. Oh, indeed. But his caution was his downfall. You see, he never wanted to kill Peter Denholm, not initially. He preferred influence, manipulation, the shadows. But when Peter began making independent arrangements, cutting Giles out of business plans, questioning certain irregularities in client accounts, he became a threat. Lennox nodded, chewing thoughtfully on a biscuit. "So you believe the murder wasn't premeditated?" "No. I believe they met that evening behind the tea room. Denholm summoned Channing, likely to warn him he would be contacting another solicitor, perhaps even threatening him with exposure. That would have been intolerable. For a man like Channing, someone who had built his reputation on discretion and control. But the knife? An opportunity. The kitchen was accessed from the back garden, and the tea room staff had left earlier than expected due to a power outage. The back door wasn't properly locked. I suspect Channing seized the moment during an argument, likely only intending to frighten Denholm, or perhaps in the heat of it he lost control. Lennox exhaled slowly. And after, he panicked. Tried to make it look like a robbery. Planted James Bell's scarf, one he'd taken earlier, while posing as a courier. F.O.R. Arthur Bell's will revisions. Then he sealed a jam jar with falsified wax, and used it to conceal fragments of a drawing Iris Lockwood had done of Denholm, one that portrayed him in an unflattering light. A red herring, nothing more. And the note he sent you? Miss Marple's expression turned almost wistful, a classic sign of a conscience trying to unburden itself without truly confessing. He thought if he could distract me, perhaps redirect suspicion, he might buy time or mislead me. Lennox leaned forward. "But how did you guess him, of all people?" Miss Marple poured more tea with delicate care. "Two reasons, really. One, he was always present, but never questioned. A solicitor with ties to everyone, the tea room, Denholm's estate, even Dorothy Munsell. And two, the jam." "The jam?" Giles Channing brought a jar to the fete. He claimed it was from a relative, but I noticed the wax was textured, gritty. Sealing wax, not preserving wax. And the label was identical in handwriting to the note I received, only the ink had faded slightly due to water damage. When I compared it, it matched. She smiled. "No detail is too small, Inspector. Not when human nature is involved." The news of Channing's arrest sent ripples across Maplebrook, but they did not crash. Instead, the village absorbed the truth in measured waves. There were no great upheavals, no public outbursts, only small conversations at shop counters and over back fences, where neighbors reassured each other that the worst had passed. Letitia Blackwood reopened the tea room 2 days later, quietly and without fanfare. She wore mourning gray and served scones and tea to a half-full room, her dignity intact. Though the shadows around her eyes remained, her hands no longer trembled when she poured Iris Lockwood, too, returned to her art. She hosted a modest showing at the community hall the following Saturday, featuring delicate ink portraits of the villagers, Mr. Trent of the butchery, Mrs. Dalrymple with her lace gloves, even Constable Pike with his bicycle. They were well received, and the vicars, Wife declared Iris quite rehabilitated in the moral as well as the artistic sense. Dorothy Munsell, for her part, remained reticent. But one afternoon she appeared unannounced at Miss Marple's gate, holding a paper-wrapped package. "It's just a fruit-cake," she said stiffly, "but I thought you ought to have it." "Very kind of you," Miss Marple said warmly. "Shall we sit a moment?" Dorothy hesitated, then nodded. They sat beneath the cherry tree in Elspeth's garden, where the breeze carried the faint scent of lilac. "I imagine," Dorothy said slowly, "you know everything." "Not everything," Miss Marple replied, gently, "only what matters." Dorothy's shoulders relaxed. She looked up, meeting Miss Marple's eyes. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said. "Least of all Jane's. It was a different time. I lost my position, and then I lost my nerve." Miss Marple nodded. "We all have things we carry. The only difference is whether we let them weigh us down or pass them to others." Dorothy swallowed hard. "I should leave Maplebrook. Start again somewhere," Miss Marple smiled. "Or stay and let people see who you've become." A long silence passed. Dorothy nodded. "Perhaps," she said, the following Sunday. The church bells rang with a warmth not heard since before the murder. The pews were full, and though no one spoke of Peter Denholm directly, his absence was finally acknowledged in the lifted eyes during hymns, in the quiet peace during the vicar's reading. After the service, villagers gathered in the green for lemonade and sponge cake, as though reclaiming something they had lost. Miss Marple sat beneath the elm tree near the west wall, knitting needles, clicking softly. Elspeth brought her a scone, and the vicar's youngest daughter presented her with a flower pressed between pages of a hymn book. "Miss Marple," she asked, tilting her head, "how did you know who it was?" Miss Marple smiled down at her. "Oh, I didn't, not at first. But people are very much like knitting patterns, you know. There's always a design beneath the surface, if you know how to read the stitches." The girl blinked, clearly unconvinced, but impressed all the same. "And what about the others? The ones who didn't do it?" "They'll find their way," Miss Marple said. "In villages, truth may arrive slowly, but it rarely leaves unfinished." The child nodded sagely and skipped off to chase a butterfly. Miss Marple watched her go, the sun warm on her shoulders, the world resettling itself around her. The pattern had completed, the stitch corrected, and for now, at least, all was quiet. Section 10. Aftermath summer in Maplebrook unfolded with slow grace in the days following Giles Channing's arrest. The roses clambered higher over garden gates, and the bees resumed their gentle dominion over the hedgerows. The sense of something restored hung lightly in the air, like the final bars of a symphony returning to their key. Though the murder of Peter Denholm had been solved, its echoes had not fully faded. They lived on in the silences between conversations, in glances exchanged at the greengrocer's stall, in the small but meaningful shifts in people's routines. It is the way of small villages to absorb pain gently, not through erasure, but through acceptance. Miss Marple had seen it all before. She sat one afternoon on Elspeth's shaded veranda, knitting a cardigan for the vicar's newest grandchild, a soft butter-yellow wool, chosen not for sentiment but practicality. A pot of tea stood at her side, cooling slightly in the summer heat. Across the lane, Iris Lockwood was painting again, this time the garden gate of Miss Dorothy Munsell's cottage. They spoke in quiet tones as Iris worked, the conversation slow and halting. It was not friendship yet, but the cautious beginning of something like it. Dorothy had not left. Maplebrook. Miss Marple had not advised her one way or the other. People, she believed, came to the right choices in their own time, so long as they were gently encouraged to examine their hearts with honesty. Dorothy had resumed her weekly trips to the library and even joined the Women's Institute's flower committee, where she now arranged Lily with the same meticulous precision she once reserved for her Latin conjugations. Letitia Blackwood had returned to her post at the Maplebrook Tea Room, albeit with shorter hours and a more subdued demeanor. Her once prize-themed teas, Victorian afternoons, Georgian creams, and the like had been quietly retired. Now she served a simple selection of sponge cakes and scones, with pots of Ceylon or Darjeeling, and a soft, "How are you today?" For each customer. Miss Marple visited often not for the tea, which remained average, but to bear witness to Letitia's quiet courage. "She hasn't smiled much," Elspeth noted one day as they passed Letitia's window. "No, Miss Marple." "Agreed. But she serves every cup with both hands now, and that tells you more about her healing than 1,000 smiles might." "Do you think she forgive herself?" Miss Marple thought for a moment. "In time. Forgiveness, my dear, is like jam. It takes patience, heat, and the willingness to let the bitter and the sweet blend properly." And that evening, a letter arrived by post. It was from James Bell, forwarded from Eastbourne, written in a cautious hand on thick stationery. "Dear Miss Marple, I do not know how to thank you. You saw what others didn't, or perhaps chose not to. I was frightened, but I see now that I was also complicit in a silence that nearly cost more than one life. Mr. Channing once helped me, or so I thought. I never imagined what he was capable of. Uncle Arthur is recovering well. I'll be visiting again soon, though I doubt I'll stay long. Maplebrook holds too many shadows for me now. Still, it is good to know that truth has been aired, and that you quietly and without fuss set things right. With deepest respect, James Bell." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her box of correspondence beside a note from an old colonel she'd once helped out of a blackmail scheme, and a postcard from Major Palgrave's niece in the Caribbean. Her life, she often thought, had not been one of great adventures in the traditional sense. No ships, no wars, but there had been people, and wherever there are people, there are puzzles. That Sunday the vicar preached a sermon on the unseen labors of the righteous. Most assumed it referred to St. Paul or Moses. Elspeth, however, nudged her aunt and whispered, "I think he meant you." Miss Marple smiled, eyes still on the altar. "If he did, it would be most unsuitable. I merely observe. Other people do the hard parts, lying, hiding, and occasionally confessing." Later that week, Inspector Lennox made a final call. They sat in Elspeth's drawing room with tea and Madeira cake. The inspector, for once, did not look weary but relieved. The Crown Prosecution Service has enough to formally charge Channing, he said. The motive's clear and the evidence is compelling. He's not contesting any of it. Says he's resigned to consequence. Miss Marple gave a small nod. "That is the final symptom of pride, Inspector. When pride is pierced, what follows is surrender, not remorse." Lennox shook his head. We never would have found him without you." She raised a mild hand. No, I imagine you'd have gotten there eventually," he smiled, "but probably after one or two more corpses." They shared a brief chuckle, then fell into thoughtful quiet. Finally, Miss Marple said, "I find that the cleverest criminals often fail because they assume the people around them aren't watching. But in a village like ours, nothing goes truly unnoticed. It's all about whether you understand what you're seeing, and you always do." "I try, Inspector. I try." The next day, Mrs. Dalrymple hosted a modest fete on the village green to raise funds for a new roof for the bell tower. There was no banner, no music, just simple Stall's rhubarb tarts, lemon squash, some second-hand books, and a knitting circle that raised more than anyone expected by auctioning off a tea, cozy shaped like the vicar's dog Dot. Miss Marple spent an hour at the cake table and another beside the roses, nodding to friends and strangers alike. She accepted compliments with modest grace and asked after everyone's relations as if nothing extraordinary had passed in recent weeks. By dusk, the fete wound down, the tables cleared, the last cups drained. As the sun dipped behind the village, rooftops and the first crickets began to chirp, Miss Marple walked home with her parasol tucked under one arm. Her steps were slow, not from age but from habit. She had long believed that walking slowly through a place told you more than walking quickly ever could. Dot at the gate to Elspeth's cottage. She paused and turned back to look at the green. Children were chasing each other with sticky fingers and scuffed knees. Mrs. Winchell was folding up gingham bunting with precise corners. Iris Lockwood was painting a quick sketch of the bell tower before the light disappeared, and Letitia Blackwood stood beside Dorothy Munsell. Two women not speaking, but not walking away from each other either. There it was again, the village, not quite healed, but no longer broken. Miss Marple opened the gate and stepped inside. There would be another crime someday, somewhere. Another whisper, another wound disguised as gossip. But for now she would finish her cardigan and begin a new pot of jam, perhaps gooseberry this time, and she would, as always, pay attention, because where human nature resided, so too did truth. And truth, Miss Marple believed, had the quietest footsteps of all. Section 11. Echoes in the tea leaves 2 weeks after the fete. Summer drifted lazily across the hedgerows of Maplebrook, weaving gold into the grasses and honey into the afternoon light. The village had begun to fall back into its routines: morning markets, shared chatter in the post office, the Sunday rhythm of church bells and sponge cakes. But even amidst the slow return to normalcy, Miss Marple remained watchful, not from suspicion. No, not exactly, but from the certainty that human nature seldom resolved itself cleanly. The solving of a murder might remove the criminal, but not always the consequences. It was on such an afternoon, bright and unassuming, that Miss Marple found herself once more at the Maplebrook Tea Room, sitting alone at the table nearest the lace-curtained window. Letitia Blackwood approached with a warm pot of Earl Grey and a single carrot scone. "No Georgian afternoon today?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice touched with fondness. Letitia gave a small smile. "I think I'll stick to simple tea and scones for a while. They don't ask questions." Miss Marple nodded, taking her cup with both hands. mirroring the gesture Letitia herself had adopted in recent weeks. The tea room, though still modest in its footfall, had taken on a curious serenity. There was no longer a tension in the air, only an absence, something missing from the space, like a picture removed from a wall where its shadow still lingered. Letitia hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Do you ever think of him, Peter?" Miss Marple sipped. "Often, and not kindly, I'm afraid." Letitia glanced around. "I don't know what's worse, what he did to me or what I let him do." "You did what many do when threatened," Miss Marple replied. "You yielded to shame. It's a powerful motivator, deadlier than greed in some ways." Letitia was quiet for a long moment. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd stood up to him." Miss Marple set down her cup. "You might have lost your tea room, but you'd have kept your peace." Letitia gave a sad smile. "Too late for peace." "Never too late," Miss Marple said softly. "Only more difficult." Just then the doorbell chimed. A tall woman entered, wearing a well-pressed skirt suit and holding a folder under one arm. Letitia's shoulders stiffened. "That's James Bell's solicitor, from London." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Curious. He said he wasn't returning." The woman approached, asked for Letitia by name, and handed her a sealed envelope before departing, without ordering a single thing. Letitia stared at it as though it might catch fire in her hands. Miss Marple waited. Finally, Letitia broke the wax and unfolded the letter within. Her eyes flicked across the page once, then twice more, as if to confirm what she was reading. She passed the letter across the table with trembling fingers. Miss Marple, read. "Dear Miss Blackwood, per Mr. James Bell's instructions, I write to confirm the transfer of partial ownership of the Maplebrook Tea Room to your name alone. Mr. Bell has forfeited all financial claims to the property, stating it was never mine to begin with. No further correspondence will be sent unless initiated by you. Please find enclosed a legal deed and transfer documents. Yours sincerely, Catriona Elmsley." Solicitor Elmsley and Borage, London. Miss Marple looked up. Letitia's face was unreadable, though her lips had parted slightly, as if holding back tears she wasn't sure she had the right to shed. "He's let it go," she said faintly. "After everything." Miss Marple folded the letter. "Perhaps he has, or perhaps he's passing. The torch and the responsibility." Letitia blinked. "What responsibility?" "To make something good of what remains," Miss Marple said. "You were not the only one who suffered, but you're the one who still lives here. And you can decide what this place will be." Letitia looked around the tea room, then, not with fear, as she had for weeks, but with something like cautious hope. "I could paint the windowsills," she said quietly. "They're chipped. An excellent place to start." That evening, Miss Marple sat once more on her porch, a shawl around her shoulders, and the scent of honeysuckle curling in the breeze. She watched as the lamplighter passed down the street, a quaint tradition maintained, more out of charm than necessity. Elspeth emerged from the cottage with a small bowl of stewed plums. "I saw Mrs. Blackwood today," she said. "She looked almost cheerful." Miss Marple smiled. "Ownership can have that effect." "I also passed Mr. Trent, who says Dorothy Munsell has offered to tutor his daughter for her Cambridge entrance." "Well," Miss Marple replied, "some minds require careful pruning before they're ready to bloom. I imagine Miss Munsell will enjoy that." They ate in silence for a while. The clink of spoons and the evening bird song the only sounds. Then Elspeth said, "Do you think there will be more trouble?" Miss Marple considered. "Always, but not from the same place." She rose, walked to the edge of the path, and looked out over the village rooftops glowing orange in the fading sun. "You see, my dear," she said, "evil seldom strikes the same spot twice. It moves like weather, but it leaves behind certain barometric changes. We feel them long after the storm has passed." Elspeth tilted her head. "And what do we do about them?" "We plant gardens," Miss Marple replied, "and keep our doors latched, and we notice things." She smiled. Noticing is half the battle. The next day, Miss Marple received a small package in the post. It was unmarked except for a single return address in Kent. Inside was a slim sketchbook. On the first page, a charcoal drawing of the tea room's garden gate, slightly ajar. On the second, Miss Marple herself, seated at the lace window table, her knitting in her lap and her eyes lifted just slightly, as if she were watching something no one else could see. At the back of the sketchbook was a note. "I didn't know how to say thank you, so I drew instead. You see what others don't. I only try to follow. Iris, Miss." Marple smiled and placed the sketchbook on her mantel, a tribute not to herself, but to the art of observation. And in that quiet act, the last page of the affair turned not closed, but completed. For now. Section 12. A whisper on the wind. It was the waning end of August, and in Maplebrook the lazy hum of bees had grown softer, as if even nature were preparing for the hush of autumn. Leaves trembled with the faintest blush of amber, while the edges of the village green had begun to dry, curling into the parchment tones of late summer. Miss Marple, well acquainted with the rhythms of her village, knew this time as a season of pause and reckoning. It was when harvest talk overtook gossip, and when old secrets like the first frost threatened to creep silently from the hedgerows. She took her afternoon walk as usual, along the sun-dappled path that curved behind the rectory, where the duck pond lay hidden from the road by a fringe of reeds and weeping willow. The stillness there was a comfort, a place not yet touched by the scurry of schoolboys or the chatter of church ladies. It was, she always felt, a place where people came to think or to avoid thinking. On this particular afternoon, someone had arrived ahead of her. Miss Marple, ever observant, noticed her even before she rounded the bend. A slim young woman seated on the old bench, her silhouette precise against the glow of the pond. She was dressed neatly, but not extravagantly, in elegant skirt suit in dove gray, smartly tailored, and likely city-made. Her short bob framed a delicate face and a certain wariness, sharpened by the set of her jaw. New. That alone made Miss Marple pause. In Maplebrook, new people stood out not because they were loud or clumsy, but because they carried themselves differently, more like passers-through than settlers. And this one, she noted, sat as if the bench were borrowed rather than belonged. As Miss Marple approached, the girl turned and offered a polite but brief smile, her eyes alert and penetrating. "You've found one of the most peaceful corners of the village," Miss Marple said with gentle warmth. "It's lovely," the young woman replied. Her voice was low and clear, with a neutral accent, refined but deliberately subdued. Quiet. Almost too quiet. Miss Marple lowered herself carefully onto the other end of the bench, her walking stick placed neatly beside her. A fair observation, though I've always found the quietest places carry the loudest echoes. That earned a curious look. You must be Miss Marple. I must, she said, with a faint smile. And you? Clara Hargreaves. A family name, perhaps? My mother's side. I use it professionally. Ah, said Miss Marple, knitting a few mental stitches to tuck away later. Not married. Not a miss in the formal sense. Uses a maiden name, possibly theatrical or journalistic. Curious. I'm staying with my aunt, Clara continued. Mrs. Keene, over on the Crescent. Her husband passed earlier this year, and she's not fond of being alone. A thoughtful gesture, dear. Mrs. Keene is a splendid gardener. Her foxgloves won first prize last year, though she's too modest to mention it. Clara smiled again, this time more genuinely. She had fine, intelligent eyes, Miss Marple noted. But behind them sat something unsettled. Restlessness, or perhaps wariness disguised as casualness. I used to come here as a child, Clara said, turning her gaze back to the pond. Maplebrook always seemed like a place that existed outside time. I thought it would be comforting. And has it been? Clara didn't answer straight away. A breeze stirred the surface of the pond, sending ripples toward the bank, and the ducks murmured restlessly among themselves. Not quite, she said at last. People watch a lot here. Indeed they do, Miss Marple said with a nod. We don't do it to be unkind, you know. It's simply that when the days are long and lives are close, there's time to notice. Habits, rhythms, silences. Clara tilted her head. That sounds like the beginning of a poem or a warning. Perhaps both. Another smile. Clara adjusted her cuff, revealing a slim wrist and the faintest trace of an ink stain. You're a writer, I imagine? Miss Marple offered lightly. I was Anne. I'm taking a bit of a break from writing, from certain questions, she said, her gaze sharpening again. London isn't exactly a forgiving place when you ask the wrong ones. Indeed, cities tend to punish curiosity. Villages, on the other hand, merely hide from it. There was a pause. The ducks quacked indignantly as one attempted to steal the other's crust. Then Clara leaned back, arms folded. You're testing me, aren't you? Miss Marple's needles, which had emerged from her handbag and begun quietly casting stitches, did not pause. Oh, no, dear. I've given up tests. I simply listen. People always tell you what you need to know if you let them fill the silence. Clara blinked, clearly unused to such gentle directness. I came here to ask questions, she admitted, about the solicitor, Giles Channing. Miss Marple's knitting slowed just slightly. I was under the impression the papers had moved on, she said mildly. They have, but I'm not writing for the papers. Then for whom? Clara didn't answer. Instead, she stood, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. Well, she said, it was nice talking with you. I imagine I'll be seeing more of you. Miss Marple looked up. You'd be surprised how often people do. Clara hesitated, just for a second, as though weighing a reply she didn't voice. Then she turned and walked away, her steps too controlled to be casual, her posture that of someone balancing two thoughts at once. Miss Marple watched her until she vanished around the bend. Only then did she rise and walk toward the post office. Mrs. Danvers, ever the custodian of unofficial records, greeted her with a smile. Miss Marple, looking lovely as always. Is it a parcel you're after? No, no. Just a touch of curiosity today. Mrs. Danvers leaned forward, eager. Who's caught your eye now? A young woman. Clara Hargreaves. Says she's staying with Mrs. Keene. Oh, yes, her. Arrived 3 days ago. Very polite. Said she was researching something for a story. But not for a book, she said. Definitely not fiction. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. She asked me about Giles Channing, and Mr. Denholm, too. Said she was gathering impressions. I thought she meant a magazine piece, but she was very evasive about where it might appear. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back along the green. That evening, with twilight lapping gently at the edges of the garden, she sat by her writing desk and opened her small ledger, the one reserved not for shopping lists or church events, but for names and details that required. Watching Dot, she wrote in crisp, neat strokes. Clara Hargreaves. Arrived the 23rd of August. Stated purpose. Family visit. Actual interest. Channing Denholm case. Profession. Unspecified. Accent. Refined. Observant. Guarded Dot then in the corner of the page. She added, not all questions are answered by facts. Some require patience and tea. She closed the book and returned to her knitting. Dot outside. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and wood smoke. And far in the distance, a single crow passed over the rooftops with a harsh cry-brief. But not unnoticed. Dot, Miss Marple folded her hands and waited. Dot, after all. Questions had a way of returning to those patient enough to sit with them. And Maplebrook, for all its charm, had not yet run out of mysteries. Section 13. The girl with the golden pennant was on the third morning of Clara Hargreaves' stay in Maplebrook that something shifted subtle as it turned page, but no less meaningful. The village, which had cautiously regarded her with the polite curiosity afforded to newcomers, now began to sense that she might not be passing through after all. Miss Marple, for her part, had noticed this shift not in what Clara did, but in what she didn't do. She hadn't yet visited the vicarage. She hadn't introduced herself to the W.I. committee, despite being seen reading the bulletin pinned near the grocer's till. And most telling of all, she hadn't once returned to the tea room for someone supposedly here to rest and assist her bereaved aunt. She was curiously selective in her company. On this particular morning, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden with a pot of second flush, congealing and a half-finished copy of Country Life spread across her lap. Her knitting lay untouched on the wicker table beside her. She was not looking at the magazine, but rather beyond it through the trellis, down the garden path, toward the hedge break that offered a fine view of the lane. She did not have long to wait. Clara appeared with the punctuality of someone used to schedules, dressed crisply in a linen blouse and skirt, a satchel slung over one shoulder, and a fountain pen tucked behind one ear like a painter's brush. She was not walking idly. She was walking purposefully, and she turned, quite suddenly, into the old lane that led toward the south boundary of the village. Where are you going, I wonder? Miss Marple murmured, rising carefully from her chair. 10 minutes later, with sun hat in place and parasol at her side, she set off in the same direction, not hurriedly, for one never chases such things, but with a casual stroll befitting a woman of her age and interests. The south lane led past the old schoolhouse now, disused and boarded up except for the small field where the scouts sometimes camped. Few villagers took that path anymore, and even fewer ventured past a rusted iron gate at the end, which marked the footpath to Wicker's hollow dot. It was here that Miss Marple paused. She could see Clara through the thin line of hawthorn trees. The girl had stopped by the low stone wall and was sitting on a stump with a notebook open on her knees. She wasn't sketching or making idle observations. She was writing. Fast. Her hand moved with trained confidence, occasionally pausing to underline something or flip a page with the absent-minded air of someone following a well-worn internal rhythm. Miss Marple tilted her head. This was not the writing of someone indulging in memoir or whimsy. This was the work of a professional, and yet Clara had said she was not working, only visiting. Miss Marple quietly doubled back along the path and made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Arkwright, recently returned from a diocesan retreat, greeted her with the usual mix of deference and genuine fondness. "I won't keep you long," she said, accepting a seat in his study. "But I do wonder, have you had occasion to speak with young Miss Hargreaves?" "Clara, I believe her name is." The vicar leaned back in his chair. "Only briefly. She came by just after Matins 2 days ago. Asked about our church archives." "Indeed? Curious subject for someone assisting a grieving aunt." She said she was interested in old parish records, scandals, burials, things of that nature. I assumed she had a family history project in mind. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. "Did she ask about Peter Denholm?" The vicar's brow furrowed. "Not directly, but she mentioned the tea room. Wanted to know if it had always been owned by the Blackwoods." "Did you tell her?" "I said what I knew, that Mrs. Blackwood inherited it from her uncle some 15 years ago. I didn't think much of it. Should I have?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, rising, "though I always find it curious when people ask about what's already been concluded." That evening, Miss Marple invited Dorothy Munsell to tea. The former schoolmistress arrived precisely on time, her shoes polished and her expression unreadably neutral. She had returned to village life with a quiet determination, involving herself in church flowers, children's tutoring, and lately a campaign to have a war memorial restored near the green. "Clara Hargreaves," Miss Marple said gently as she poured. "What do you make of her?" Dorothy considered the question as she stirred her tea. "Unusual girl," she said at last. "Quite intelligent, reserved, but not unfriendly. She came by to ask about Giles Channing's time on the local council." "Oh?" She phrased it rather delicately, something about patterns of decision-making and influences on civic funding. "I asked her if she was a reporter, and she simply said, 'Not exactly.'" "She asked me about Denholm," Dorothy added after a pause. "I told her he was a bully, that much was true, but that his murder had been resolved." She nodded and said, "Maybe for you." Miss Marple let that sit in the silence. The next morning brought an unexpected visit. Clara arrived at Miss Marple's gate with a paper bag of pastries and a look that was half curiosity, half cautious challenge. "I thought I'd return the conversation," she said, "since I always seem to be the one asking questions." Miss Marple led her to the garden table. Tea was prepared. The air was warm. A thrush sang somewhere near the back hedge. "I suppose," Clara said after a sip, "you think I'm poking around where I shouldn't." "I think," said Miss Marple, "that poking often leads to interesting discoveries. but one must always be careful what nest one's poking near. Clara smiled faintly. You're not wrong. But I didn't come to cause trouble. I came to clarify something. And what would that be? Clara drew out a slim, cream envelope from her satchel and placed it on the table. This was sent to me anonymously 3 weeks ago, at my flat in Islington. Miss Marple unfolded the letter. It was typed clipped, official in tone. You should look into what really happened at Maplebrook. The solicitor didn't act alone. There's a name you've missed. Dig carefully. A friend. Most people would ignore something like that, Clara said, folding her arms. I'm not most people. No, I imagine you're not. I've written exposes before. Financial scandals, internal fraud. I've received threats, lost contracts. But I've never been tipped like this. I checked the Channing case officially closed, yes. But not everyone was satisfied, including someone willing to risk a whisper. Miss Marple passed the letter back. And what do you intend to do with this whisper? I don't know. Not yet. But I think someone else may have helped Channing, or, at the very least, looked the other way. Miss Marple was quiet for a long time. At last she said, Do you believe in evil, Miss Hargreaves? Clara blinked. I believe in fear and greed, and people who convince themselves they're not responsible. Then you'll do fine, Miss Marple said softly. But understand this, even the smallest lies in a place like Maplebrook have roots. If you dig too hard, you may find what you're not prepared to uncover. I've uncovered worse. I don't doubt it. But sometimes, she added, it's the innocent people who suffer when the past is unearthed. Clara didn't reply. She looked toward the garden hedge, where a bee hovered near a bloom. Then she stood. I'll be discreet, she said, but I am going to keep digging. Miss Marple nodded once. Then we shall both be watching. You for truth, and I for tremors. That night, Miss Marple reopened her diary. She added 2 more lines beneath Clara's name. Received anonymous tip. Believes Channing did not act alone. Investigating link between solicitor and counsel corruption. Has courage but may lack caution. And below that, truth may have roots deeper than we thought. The air had turned cooler by then, and in the distance thunder muttered softly over the fields beyond Wicker's Hollow. The storm wasn't yet upon them, but it was coming. Section 14. The pattern beneath the lace. The first true autumn rain fell 3 nights later, soft but steady, the kind that deepened the scent of soil and made the gas lamps flicker with ghostly halos. In Maplebrook, doors shut early, and fires were stoked long before supper. But in the back parlor of the Maplebrook Tea Room, a small, quiet gathering was underway. Miss Marple sat comfortably in a high-backed chair, shawl tucked snugly, her knitting abandoned on the side table. Across from her, Letitia Blackwood poured tea with hands that only slightly trembled. Clara Hargreaves sat between them, a notebook closed on her lap, and standing stiffly near the window, eyes guarded and jaw tight, was Edwin Settle, retired, schoolmaster and lifelong friend of the late Giles Channing. Letitia set down the teapot and glanced uncertainly toward Miss Marple. I don't see what this is about exactly. You said it was important, but... Oh, it is, Miss Marple said gently, her voice as mild as ever. And I thank you both for indulging me. It's about closure, you see. About understanding what truly happened and how we were all nearly deceived. Settle shifted. If this is about dredging up the Channing affair again, I must say it is, Miss Marple interrupted mildly, but not in the way you think. You see, something's been bothering me ever since Mr. Channing's financial improprieties came to light. There was one thing that didn't fit. She leaned forward slightly. Channing was smart, arrogant, yes, but clever, and deeply cautious. Far too cautious, I believe, to leave such a tidy paper trail, unless he wanted to be caught. Clara's brow furrowed. You think he wanted to take the blame? Not quite, Miss Marple said. But I think he knew the walls were closing in, and he preferred a narrative he could control, one that kept others out of the light. Settle's hand gripped the curtain edge. This is all speculation. Miss Marple turned to Clara. You received a letter, anonymous, warning you to look deeper. Clara nodded. Typed. No return address. Posted from Dover, but I don't think it originated there. Quite, Miss Marple said. A ruse. You see, the tip wasn't about uncovering the truth. It was about redirecting the truth. Clara blinked. You mean the letter was a trap? Not exactly. More like a warning by someone with just enough conscience to whisper, but not enough to speak? She turned her gaze fully to Edwin Settle. You were on the council finance subcommittee with Channing, were you not? Settle's expression hardened. Yes, but that was years ago. Not so many. Long enough to forget? Perhaps, but not to forgive. You lost your pension after the funding scandal in '49. It was quietly buried, of course, but I recall you left your teaching post rather suddenly, didn't you? Settle's lips pressed into a line. I never took a penny. Perhaps not then, but when Channing offered you a way back in, a small role in property acquisitions and council investments, well, perhaps you felt entitled. Letitia gasped. Edwin, surely not. Miss Marple's voice softened. I don't believe you murdered Giles Channing, but I believe you benefited. And when the funds started to vanish again and Letitia's tea room was under threat, Channing agreed to take the fall, for old time's sake, for leverage, or guilt. Settle's voice was hoarse. You have no proof. No, only patterns, behavior, and a ledger you buried in the town archive box in the school attic, the one marked 1947 to 1951 minutes. Clara blinked. How do you? I asked young Mr. Trent to have a look. He found a missing booklet hidden behind a loose board. Miss Marple took a slip of folded paper from her knitting bag and handed it to Clara. You'll find the minutes confirm that Settle and Channing signed off on 3 overlapping loan guarantees. 2 were paid off. 1 was quietly erased. Settle turned away, back stiff, hands shaking slightly as he gripped the curtain cord. I never meant harm, he said at last. Not truly. But Channing, he knew how to make things look clean. He said I'd get my pension reinstated if I helped him shift some things, paperwork, mostly. Nothing criminal, not exactly. He'd promised no one would get hurt. But someone did, Letitia said softly. You nearly cost me everything. I didn't know he was extorting you, Settle snapped. He kept that part quiet. Miss Marple sighed. That, you see, is where evil begins. Not with malice, but with selective ignorance. A man turns his eyes away and tells himself he's done nothing wrong when in truth he's merely allowed wrong to flourish. Settle sank into the window seat, defeated. I didn't kill him, he said again. No, Miss Marple agreed. That was Iris Munsell, and she's paying her price now. But the tragedy was broader. It reached deeper than just one act of violence, and it will not truly end until those who watched it unfold accept their part. There was a long silence. Then, surprisingly, Clara rose and crossed to settle, placing the paper gently in his lap. "You should speak to the council yourself," she said. "Confess. Come clean. If you don't, I will." He looked up at her, defeated but not angry. Perhaps grateful. Miss Marple rose as well. "The truth," she said gently, "is like tea left too long. Bitter, if not poured at the right time, but cleansing all the same." The next morning, the rain had stopped, and Maplebrook sparkled with dew. Miss Marple returned to the tea room, not for any confrontation, but for a cup of assam and a freshly baked apple tart. Letitia brought both without asking. "You knew," she said quietly. "I suspected," Miss Marple replied, "but only because I've spent 80 years watching people pretend." Letitia smiled, tired but lighter. "He's writing his letter of resignation. I dare say it's the first honest thing he's penned in years. Do you think the village will forgive him?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "In time. We're very good at forgiveness in villages. It's forgetting we struggle with." Letitia looked out the window. "Clara's leaving today." "Yes, but I suspect she'll be back. Do you think she'll write about it?" "She might, but only if it helps." And with that, they sat in companionable silence, the tea warm between them, the village around them quietly reshaping itself after yet another tremor in its foundation. That evening, Clara stood at the station platform, her notebook clutched. In one hand, her satchel in the other. Miss Marple had come to see her off, wrapped in a lilac shawl and carrying a modest basket of plum, jam, and seed cake. "You didn't have to," Clara said, accepting it. "But I like to," Miss Marple replied. They stood together as the train approached, the air thick with steam and the promise of London. Clara turned at the last moment. "Do you ever get tired of it? The lies, the quiet crimes?" Miss Marple considered. "No," she said softly, "because there's always one person who tells the truth, even if they don't mean to." Clara smiled. "Then I suppose I'll keep looking for them." "And I," Miss Marple said, "will keep noticing." The train hissed. Clara stepped aboard, and with a wave of her pen, not a farewell, but a promise, the girl with the golden notebook disappeared down the tracks. And in Maplebrook, peace returned, but not FORGETFULNESS. Not just yet.